Hill. So we've got two talks. First from, and I won't pronounce your name correctly, but Aditya Mahanti, and secondly from Charlotte Jones, both PhD students, so Aditya in a rather different position, being sort of part of the time here and part of the time at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur. Aditya is working with Pushpa, and good to see that Pushpa has made it back from her conference, still wearing her conference badge. And Charlotte is working with me and with James. So I won't say any more, but to hand over to Aditya, who's going to take up the first, the first 40 minutes worth, including the discussion. So I hope about 20-25 minutes, something like that, to talk. Over to you.
First of all, I place on record my sincere thanks to UCL in general and Dr. Aurobindo in particular to give me a chance to work as a Commonwealth Split-Site Scholar at UCL, which I think is very crucial for me in the way in which I think I'm undergoing a schizophrenic transition from being an urban sociologist to an urbanist, as they would say. So with that note, I begin my presentation, which in a way is a summary of a PhD project which I have been a part with for the last 2.5 years, and I think I'll be able to do justice to it, to summarize it in another 20 minutes. So let's try it out. To begin with, the title reads, which is the title of the thesis itself, Homo Civicus, or the Quotidian Politics of Civil Society in Delhi. I begin with a quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, and the quote, to read it pretty fast, is, Jose Arcadio Buendia, who was the most enterprising man ever to be seen in the village, had set up the placement of the houses in such a way that from all of them one could reach the river and draw water with the same effort. Within a few years, Macondo was a village that was more orderly and hardworking than any known until then by its 300 inhabitants. However, since the time of its founding, he had built traps and cages. In a short time, he filled not only his own house, but all of those in the village with troipials, canaries, bee-eaters, and redbreast. The concert of so many different birds became so disturbing that Ursula, his wife, would plug her ears with beeswax and so as not to lose her sense of reality. The lament expressed by the protagonist in the oft-cited lines does in a way paraphrase the unintended consequences of urban sprawl in a post-colonial setting like that of Delhi. The cacophony of urbanization, which the traps and cages of city master plans attempt to nullify, thereby leads to the concert of what one may aptly remark is none other than the contestation over the right to the city. With that note, I move on to the second slide, that is the central research question. I prefer to put the central research question not in a way which I think would make it more reader-friendly and make the audience more informed in the sense that I make it a problematic and how I diagnose to the problematic. To begin with, my reading of urban sociology literature in particular makes me feel that in line with the formulation that I've already heralded in the first slide, one would willy-nilly accept the proposition that the problematic of the urban could be conceived as a mutation in the modes of production, land, labor, and capital. To elaborate, on one hand, land, labor, and capital, for instance, are imbricated through exercises like that of urban renewal, resettlement colonies, and high-rise architecture on the spatial front. Whereas on the social front, such scalar interventions do effectuate changes in the constitution of the social through the emergence of a new communitas in the way of gated enclaves, shanty towns, and satellite townships. In such a scenario, the power participation dialectic in post-colonial democracies, especially in India, is perceived to be made up of imbrications of both the civil and political society. Scholars like Partha Chatterjee in particular, however, have gone on to hint at a rupture between these two entities. In other words, civil society hence conceived is one which is seen to be the realm of voluntary associations and advocacy groups which would say, for example, use law courts, civil suits, and the right to information or the citizens' charter to move ahead with their agendas. On the other hand, political society, in contrast, envelops the efforts made by the relatively poor, like agitating protesters, workers on strike, and social movement activists who try to work their way out through the rubric of patronage politics. Such a formulation, however, compels me and many other scholars, including our own Charlotte Libansky and Stephanie Leval, and even a new work by Malini Ranganathan, does point to the fact that such a formulation indicates towards a non-porosity of representational politics. And I say such because of the three important reasons. Number one, when you try to make a conceptualization of civil versus the political society through a category called the middle class, it is absolutely problematic because the middle class, with reference to post-colonial democracies like India, is itself an enigma. Theorizations in middle classes begin with Pranab Bardhan, Atul Kohli, and many other, including Satish Deshpande of late. Importantly, if we attempt to characterize them into two groups, one would be an economic mode of analysis of middle class, through which you try to see the middle class as a dominant proprietary class, to use the term of Bardhan, which tries to act as a hegemony of the ruling bloc. But that was all the story as long as there was a state-directed development per se. But the moment you get into there is an onset of neoliberal India in 1991, with India treading on the path of globalization, you add on the criteria of the new middle classes. Yes, a new middle class which definitely owes its genesis to the improved opportunities that liberalization offers, but does have a hint of social, cultural, and political capital that it anyway harbored from the old age. So this is where I would like to pitch in a cultural logical interpretation of the middle class rather than an economic one. And for that, I use for my study Bhagidari, which is a participatory governance model. Bhagidari in Hindi means partnership, which is a participatory governance model which was started off by the state government of Delhi in the year 2001. It started off in 2000, but then it rolled on in 2001, where they tried to convene meetings between the resident welfare associations, or neighborhood associations as they say in the global north, where they consult with departmental authorities and try to sort out their mundane problems or day-to-day problems. But for me, Bhagidari is not as simplistic as it seems. It acts as a springboard for me to see through the urban rhythm. Seeing through, in a way, indicates to to move beyond the John Scott kind of a paradigm which tries to see like the state, but I would prefer to see through the state, where I think that one needs to shift the lenses of inquiry, not by an analysis of the rituals of workshops or meetings of Bhagidari, but into the politics of social engineering. This is where I call upon the whole idea of thick descriptions that the Clifford Geertz would talk about. Quickly putting on the theoretical analytic is, when you want to move beyond a dichotomous essentialism, then we tend to feel that the moment we start analyzing post-colonial democracies, the first person who comes to our mind would be technologies of rule or governmentality, as Foucault would have termed it. But I feel that it definitely acts as an epistemological logic of political rationality through which the spaces of participation are perceptively accommodated. The techniques of calculating territory, measuring spatial coordinates, and modeling city development plans, for instance, shall definitely act as key manifestations of such a regime of governmentalization of the cityscape. But the cliched use of such a Foucauldian discourse, I feel, does provide a holistic mandate to neoliberal urbanism, which I feel is quite troubling. Reasons are twofold. I feel that it threatens to conflate two tendencies, which I call as, one, there is a macro-politics of regulative governmentality, and on the other hand, there is a micro-politics of accommodative governmentality. I would elaborate that here in this way. Foucault's conceptualization of power does provide us about the styles of reasoning that are deployed in complex ensembles of governance, which can better be designated as neoliberal. But one would, however, invariably wonder as to if at all the governmentality schema is a one-size-fits-all framework, then how are we expected to cognize the differentials of access to technologies of power? It is herein that one needs to make sense of the need for a better post-structural formulation, which offers the necessary flexibility to appreciate the second part, that is the micro-politics of accommodative governmentality. And herein I take recluse under Deleuze with his concept of smooth and striated spaces. Smooth and striated spaces of Deleuze is an extension of his overall theory of assemblages, which I feel is very important in the way in which I feel we need to look at relook at civil society, moving beyond the existing ways of looking it through Hegelian, Gramscian or Tocquevillian lenses. And for that, I will make a quick recap of what Deleuze is. He writes a book called 1,000 Plateaus, which comes as the second volume to Capitalism and Schizophrenia with a subtitle of Anti-Oedipus. And it is an extension of his idea of assemblages, where in the first volume, Assemblage, he talks about assemblage as a creation where you have a material entity and a semiotic entity, which is always in a mode of tussle. And this argument is taken forward in his idea of smooth and striated spaces. He gives us 4 models to explain it, but I took the easiest one to elucidate my point. For example, the sea and the desert are examples of smooth spaces that become striated with reference to the manipulation by the instrument of clock and the maneuvers of navigation. Both these spaces do not have an exclusionary existence, but rather act as scaffolds for each other, one seamlessly arising from the other. Applied to the present context, striated spaces on the one hand would say, for example, refer to planned settlements in a city which renders the state discernible, while on the other hand, the tacit consent that hawkers and policemen have in operation of informal bazaar economy is how the smooth spaces of quotidian politics helps us unsettle the former. Civil society, in such a sense, is an assemblage that helps us to explore a topological or context-specific analysis. It is constitutive of multiple determinants like state, market, and citizenry, yet not reducible to a teleological formulation like that of power, knowledge-power discourse. I move on to the next slide, which is the methodology, which applies a critical ethnography. In order to map the civil versus political society continuum, I would like to give a small note here that with reference to Delhi, if you talk about political society, then the 2 major political parties are the Congress and the BJP. One, a sort of a centrist party, the first being centrist, and the other being a rightist party, which keep shuffling positions as the party in opposition and the ruling party. And in terms of civil society, for our case of study, it is the Resident Welfare Association, which is seen as an archetypal of civil society. But when I move on to map this civil versus political society, I find it relevant to get into this formulation where this is the distribution of population of Delhi in terms of the different colonies. And it is very important to make us averse with the nomenclature of informality, which Ananya Roy and even De Soto have pointed out, which is so much cardinal to the analysis of urban politics in the global south. To begin with, the first one is a planned colony, which doesn't need any explanation. The second, third, fourth, and the fifth, which is very confusing, I would like to just clarify it with reference to Delhi. Delhi has 4 types of informal settlements, namely Jhuggi-Jhupri clusters. Jhuggi-Jhupri clusters are encroachments in government land which do not have any entitlements to civic amenities. Unauthorized colonies numbering around 1639 to be precise are not slums, squatters or encroachments, but these are colonies where the urban poor have bought small pieces of individual land to build houses on farmlands of urbanizing villages. These settlements are not entitled to basic amenities including piped water, sewerage, solid waste removal facilities and drainage. The third comes resettlement colonies, 52 in number, and they tell the story of demolition, relocation and a systematic process of marginalization of the urban poor. And finally, urban villages are those villages which are acquired with the Delhi Development Authority, the official arm of the Delhi government, of the central government to acquire land and develop them. The moment they acquire a certain village and develop it, that becomes an urban village. But officially an urban village is entitled to all civic amenities and services. The reality is that its condition is much worse than some of the slums in the city. In order to analyze that, I use this formula where my interview schedule goes something like this. One, I take a set of, I go for longitudinal narratives of representatives of RWAs, MLAs, MPs and councillors, which I feel is the civil society, political society, and of course representatives of the amorphous Indian bureaucracy, which consists of officers of central ministry and the state government of Delhi. The method that I use here is Boroway's concept, method of the extended case study, a method which he has taken from his mentor Max Gluckman, where what we try to do is that a case study in general would be one where we either take a typical case Or in the other case, what we try to do is we try to take a social situation. And this is a blend of both of these. So rather than taking for an apt illustration or a social situation, in the first case I could have taken maybe one resident welfare association of a certain typology. In the second case, I could have gone on to one kind of a negotiation between the actors. But what I have opted for is an extended case study, details of which is as follows. What I did was, I tried to look into this internal differentiation between the middle class. I find it very puzzling and too simplistic an idea to start saying that all urban politics is bourgeois beautification, urban cleansing, henceforth, and so on and so forth. What I tried to do was, I looked into the different categories of colonies that the Delhi government has, and they are ranked from A to H, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. There are 272 wards, which are political jurisdiction units within Delhi. None of the single wards have all the 9 typologies. So what I tried to do was, I clubbed them into 2 categories, 4 each, A to D and E to H, and I tried to find pick up a certain ward where, for example, the one in violets are under the BJP councillor, and the one in reds are under the Congress councillor, but the ones which are adjacently placed are nearby. So this is the location of the sites of the study. But then why did I take that? There is another reason for this. Now this is the map of Delhi. What is important here is I have taken these wards, somehow or the other fall in the southern part of Delhi, and why I take it is this. Now these two things, entities on the borders, indicate the multi-centered metropolitan region. Yes, they indicate Gurgaon and Noida, which definitely has a great role to play in which urban politics and urban spatial entities do shape themselves in these units. So these are the 4 units which I had already, and this is the map in terms of relative space. And in absolute space, these are the entities which geographers will cut out into. And next, I get into the key findings. I'll try to be very quick. I'll begin with, in each one, what I try to show is, each of these spaces is either smooth or striated to begin with. But the smooth do not remain as smooth to begin with, and they end up being striated, as Deleuze would have said it, and the striated ends up becoming smooth through civil society. The first entity that I analyzed was the Panchasheel enclave RWA, which is a gated enclave, as is very evident. It was a striated space where rules are well carved out, and there was no problem in the way in which you perceive governmentality. But what happens is that there is a smoothening up of civil society in an act of defiance. Why do I call it as so? The Panchasheel enclave RWA representatives, unlike Partha Chatterjee's essentialization of they being pro-Bhagidari and being up for it, were very pessimistic about it. Because they feel that they did an act of which I would say use Derrida's sense of deference, where they tried to have an alternative governance model, and because they were, on one hand, they were assured of the basic rights and services of the state which were very much in place. For example, there was a case of high mast street lighting. Now what they did was that they asked the councillor to help them get it. He refused because of political reasons, and what they did was that they offsetted that by going to the MLA, and they have a huge amount of collections, which was obviously very critical to the amount of seed money, the matching grant that they would have got otherwise. They also had an independent storage system, and hence I asked some of the representatives, and their attendance in the last 2 years were 3 meetings, whereas 4 meetings are taken up every month. And apart from that, they did use this high RWA fees collection to club it up with a fund called the I Care My Delhi Fund, which has a seed money of around 1 million rupees for each revenue district, and which is taken care of by the Deputy Commissioner. Mind you, here I want to make a very subtle difference between the fact that the heads of the Bhagidari system are the revenue divisional commissioners, which are a part of the elite higher echelons of the Indian bureaucracy. Councillors are not a part of a participatory governance model, so-called governance model like Bhagidari. In the second instance, I get Malviya Nagar, which was a mixed land use colony, and hence the politics was much more interesting. It was a striated space where things were well cut out, but the politics there was more interesting than this one. Number one, what happened was, they were very ambivalent to the idea of Bhagidari. There were 2 instances. Number one, there's this whole problem of encroachment which keeps on happening in these mixed land use colonies. One of the representatives of the RWA said that using Bhagidari, they had 7 rounds of meeting and ensure that on such and such date, a certain amount of peddlers and hawkers would be taken off the streets and they would be issued identity cards for them to come at a certain time. They were not atrocious animals trying to ward them off. They were interested. The point was that they were trying, this photograph here is that street which blocks a hospital, and hence they were interested about having a certain timing for these hawkers. But the next day when as per the orders of the divisional commissioner through the Bhagidari system came, the policemen had already informed them and they had already gone off. So this is what I call as the interesting idea of the facade of encroachment. Then there is the elusive promise of parking facility. When the city development plans were made, these RWs were taken in consultation and they paid 1.5 lakhs per household to develop a parking facility so that the encroachments do not happen, as the cars could then be parked. But the money has been taken by the MCD, which is as elusive as ever. The third area is Khirki extension, which is an unauthorized colony. Yes. Now this is a very smooth space in the sense that since it is an unauthorized colony, you have been given a populist liberty to act the way you can until and unless you grease the palms of the councillor. But they are I would say that over-optimistic about the Bhagidari campaign because they find that the RWA forum helps them to score points on their regularization drive. Yes, this is where I say that the smooth spaces start becoming straightened. But there is 3 interesting points which I make out here. One is the tale of absentee gentrification. What I call as absentee gentrification is that the residents of these arenas are not the ones who definitely own the houses, have not sold it off, but have rented it out and stay in gated enclaves. So, because you can be a part of the Resident Welfare Association only if you own a house, so the residents are not a part of it. The absentee landlords are a part to twist the rules of the game. Then there is a proxy participation, which I've already discussed. And here what they interestingly do is that most of the RW representatives here try to bargain their position for their houses in the gated enclaves through the cultural capital with the higher echelons of bureaucracy, whereas when they want to get patron-client relation kind of they call it a Mai Baap Sarkar syndrome, where you try to vouch for certain populist benefits, they try to invoke their social capital of Bhagidari. Finally, it's the Khirki village, the innocent Khirki village, which was village to begin with and still remains a village, the best part is that Khirki village is the chicken or the egg, I don't know which is what. One of them is, Khirki village is the one which was the original settlement, and the Khirki extension is an extension which has a property value higher than Khirki village. So the sprawl is better than the organic entity. And they have started blocking roads, and this is what has happened to Khirki village of late. I would like to quickly put up 2 points here. On the right hand side there is a picture which they call, this is the Banjara camp, which Banjara camp, this is not the, they are people, herdsmen and milchmen from nearby villages in Gurgaon, who own houses in Gurgaon, but they have started coming and settling up the hutments here because they feel that they can sell milk at a higher price over here. Whereas these poor Khirki village people, although they own the land, have been dilly-dallying the government officials who keep on shifting Bhagidari dates, where every date is seen by a new officer and the file moves to another department, horticulture to architecture, to the Delhi Development Authority. But they still feel that the ritualism of Bhagidari would have some hope. Finally, there is this interesting idea where they need to take care of the greasy palms of the municipal councillors, because mind you, Khirki village is a village which falls within the Lal Dora. Lal Dora is an area which falls within the precincts of an architectural entity called Khirki Masjid. Hence, within 100 meters of that architectural mosque, you cannot build houses which are more than 3 floors. But the rule, as usual, keeps dangling, and there are rules of exception. Finally, this is on the macrocosm level. I feel that there is a conceit of civil society. To begin with, let me make it very clear here that the Governance Chronicle of Delhi has something which I call as a plurality of hierarchy. Number 1, there is the authority, central government authority, which plans lands. There is a municipal authority under the state government but autonomous from it, which is supposed to take care of water storage and other basic facilities. And then there is the Union Territory of Delhi, which plans and gives the budgets to the MCD. So the idea is that one entity takes care of swarming millions to get in, with the other being clueless about how many are getting into it. So under such a troubled scenario, what happens in the new liberal framework in the post-1990s is this. That you have a program like Bhagidari, which obviously is in a way kind of new urban politics where urban managerialism is trying to be invoked in, and you try to pitch in RWAs with complete disregard to the councillor. Interestingly, what has happened is in the last 10 years, the councillors have tried to twist the game here. What they did was that they tried to set up resident ward committees. What resident ward committees are is that every ward will now have a resident ward committee which will be headed by a ward councillor and cooperated by the resident welfare associations there. So the program of Bhagidari, which was started by the state government of Delhi, was offsetted by the municipal council of Delhi by this move. But that was not all. One would critically mull over the critical events that meandered off in the aftermath of the creation of RWCs. What happened was that in an attempt to offset these territorial gains, the Delhi government started trifurcating the municipal council of Delhi so that at least some parts of it fall under it. Whereas the plurality of 3 MCDs and the consequent overlapping of civic functions coupled with the financial inequity were of course inevitable impediments to good governance. But the fact that the central government of Delhi is the Congress government, which is the same party that the Delhi government is in sync with, it could get it off. But however, the central government, in its bid to concede to the demands of the state government, did fork a rider. And what it did was that it ensured that the coordinating agency of the 3 municipal zones would rest with the Ministry of Home Affairs, that is the central government. So what I feel is the state government of Delhi has now witnessed a sordid saga where it is almost strangulated decentralized governance at the behest of what I would call as a federal Frankenstein. So finally, I would like to conclude here in the sense that, one, we had upper middle class colonies where I find that the spectre of power lurks within the spaces of participation. You have a low middle class colony where the penumbra of legality taints the spaces of participation. So what I feel is, Avatar A civil society is one where there is a smooth space of bureaucratic anarchy. You find the bureaucracy a big time anarchy. Avatar B, civil society, becomes a very orderly, striated space of bureaucratic conviviality where the hitherto smooth spaces of urban villages and unauthorized colonies get a platform to interact with the state officials. Thus, the present post-structural interrogation does explore as to how actors in the power matrix differentially apply permutation and combinations of their social, cultural and economic capital. Civil society in such a scenario is seen to operate neither in conjunction nor in disjunction with the state. Rather, what I feel, it acts as a differentiated torque through which the state and the citizenry start negotiating the position within a space which I would call is a symbiotic space of neo-populist sovereignty. It is in this sense that Indian society of such a genre needs to be visualized through the metaphor of Homo civicus, thereby indicating a paradigm shift to what Louis Dumoux characterizes as Homo hierarchicus years ago, because the principle of communitarian hierarchy and holism, which Indian society was perceived to be built up. Indian society is comprised of communitas, which is built on hierarchy and holism. I think needs rethinking because it is undergoing a transition where it moves towards civic citizenship as the leitmotif of the new urban actor, and hence Homo civicus, or the quotidian politics of civil society. Thank you.
Questions, comments, please? Start off. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can I just take you back to the beginning of the presentation when you were talking about basically 1991 and the liberalisation of the Indian economy, what that might have done for middle classes or new middle classes and Indian civil society. So your focus is very much on present day, but I think you mentioned actually that you want to take a more of a sort of cultural rather than economic analysis of sort of social relations within the middle classes. So, can you say a bit more about how what you've been detailing has changed, I guess, kind of more historically in the last 30, 40 years? I mean, give us a richer sense of what's actually changed.
Can I take some more questions?
Maybe we should take that one first and let other people think.
I have
Push where you want to add something to that.
I mean, probably these are things we can discuss later. But as I was listening to your presentation, what struck me was your final slide where you talk about bureaucratic anarchy and bureaucratic conviviality. Whatever. What struck me was that it perhaps has to do a lot with the way state functions in India between the bureaucratic, the two-tier state, the bureaucratic state and the political state. And it seems a little bit too obvious that, of course, the upper middle class colonies were very much embedded in the Indian bureaucracy. Most of them are Indian bureaucrats themselves, so it is obvious that they will try to, exploit the bureaucratic anarchic system, which they're very familiar with, and the lower middle class colonies will try to somehow go in the opposite route because of their obvious exclusion from the bureaucratic system. So they're using the Bhagidari opportunity as a way of conviving with the bureaucratic state. So I thought perhaps you might want to go back to some of the literature that talks around these divisions between the bureaucratic state and the political state, and perhaps it might be a useful way of looking at some of these distinctions, and it doesn't get reduced to stating the obvious kind of phenomenon. The other question I really had was in terms of Charlotte Lemensky's work in some of these colonies in Delhi, which has come out in Transactions recently, where she actually identifies the phenomenon as a missing middle, whereas you're identifying it as a phenomenon of a very active and kind of a cunning middle class. So I was wondering what your responses would be to the way she has described the politics of the missing middle versus the way you have identified a very richly embedded middle class.
There were three questions here, one from Dr. Harris and two from Dr. Aurobindo. I feel the first and Dr. Harris, your question and Dr. Aurobindo's question about, I'll answer them together, but I'll first start with Dr. Lemansky's article, which I did read day before yesterday, or the Transaction Institute of British Geographers online edition. Now the idea here is this, to begin with that. Now what Lemansky and Stephanie Lewall do is, they take recourse to studies done on Bhagidari already. John Harris, Asher Gertner, and the third one was John Harris and Maudsley. Now what they say is that X, Y, and ABC, what they do is they try to pitch civil versus political society by studying elite colonies or slums. But what they would like to talk about is a missing middle, which is the unauthorized colony. But which I feel is justifiable enough in the sense within the given scope of a paper. But what I'm trying to do is I do agree with the conceptualization that definitely analyzing civil and political society with the elite versus poor paradigm is problematic, and hence we need to find out the missing middle. But the idea that the missing middle is not only unauthorized colonies, and there are overlaps between so I would rather say that the upper middle class gated enclaves, lower middle class slums overlap with the missing middle unauthorized colonies, and hence what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to study one each of them, and hence in the form of an extended case study. Now, in terms of the economy, yes, this is a very interesting question, which I think is linked to a long drawn analysis of survey of literature. There is this new work by Leela Fernandez which talks about India's new middle classes, which I think in a way explains this transition from bureaucratic state to the political state. What happens is the political sociology analysis of the Indian middle class have invariably, more than not, tried to toe in a very, I would say, a C. Wright Mills kind of a circumvirate theory, where they will say that the techno-managerial class is in hand in glove with the bureaucratic class, and because the state is the benefactor and the manufacturer of the governmental paradigms, they will try to chiffon the benefits from it, and hence in the northern context you will have a roll-out liberalism, roll-back liberalism kind of idea, which Peck and Tickle will talk about. But which definitely makes sense about how you get instigated about the way in which middle classes do process. But B, the fact that neoliberal India has 92% of its workers in the informal sector and the purview of the state is fast receding, trying to essentialize that as a straitjacket category to analyze the bureaucracy, the middle class, would be problematic. Hence, we need to look into new lenses where the so-called private sector is liberatory and accommodative and emancipatory, but yet has cleavages through which access to social and cultural capital, and hence Deshpande's interesting work shows that there is a huge amount of recruitment of upper Hindu middle class segments of the Indian society who have had historical privileges, have tried to chiffon off benefits even in the new avatar. But definitely when we try to talk about a cultural-logical avatar, what I'm trying to stress here is that it is not the amount of money that you command which helps you twist the rules of the game, but what it also matters is that whether you know the right connections to get the money into, even if you don't possess it. So accumulation by dispossession is not necessary. It can also be accumulation by discovery in a way. So, and about the bureaucratic and the political state, I think I do need to revisit some more literature which I think which will reinforce my argument. I will look into it.
On what using the smooth striated space metaphor does for you, because it sets up quite a binary relationship. And I think from some of the discussion you suggested, you're interested in thinking through quite the complexities of the engagements between these different communities and various state actors. And that's really very nuanced. And I think you're offering potentially quite a strong critique of the civil political society distinction. So here are people who ought to be operating in civil society, actually very much in the mucky world of having to negotiate, pragmatic rights in the city with low-level bureaucrats or whatever level of the state they can access. So, in fact, you cut through that distinction, and I think that's really very helpful. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm not quite clear why this binary smooth striated is really helping you. I think it's almost like broad labels for a table, and actually there's something much more interesting in the nitty-gritty of the study that you could bring out. So, kind of why you're holding on to these concepts.
I think to presume smooth, the way I used it was, I think I was not very.
So state is there, state is not there. It doesn't seem to take it very far.
Rather than that, I would feel even Deleuze doesn't maintain the binaries, and I think here what I meant, I just try to clarify myself. Here, smooth and striated are not binaries. I think I could just quote it. Nothing is ever done with smooth space allows itself to be striated, and striated space reimparts a smooth space. Perhaps we must say that progress is made by and in striated space, but all becoming occurs in smooth space. 486 Deleuze. Now, what I wanted to say here is that now we have, Partha Chatterjee toes in the line of Foucault, takes sovereign power versus governmentality paradigm, gives his theory of civil society versus political society, perfectly in sync about binary oppositions. But when I'm trying to attempt at a case where I'm trying to see that these two categories bleed into each other, I need a theoretical formulation. I felt that I needed, and of course, initially was working with Lefebvre's idea of differential space, but that I found was not that as nuanced as Deleuze is, where he tried to give this idea that, for example, the transition between the smooth and the striated is always in a state of flux, and it is never made. The whole idea of unsettling and the whole idea of becoming is what he tries to toy with his age-old concept of nomads. That yes, the smooth is as nomadic as the striated, and hence gradually from being a smooth space, you tend to become striated, and although you are a striated space, you tend to become smooth. So this is something in line with Deleuze, and I will reiterate here again that it is not a binary opposition, but beyond binary kind of a formulation. Otherwise, it really defeats the very purpose of the formula.
So that sounds really creative, analytical thinking about how these categories might be playing across one another within a case study. So my sense would be, rather than labeling this is smooth, that is right, to take the spirit of that analytic, the pattern of thinking about categorizations of processes, which might be quite illuminating. So I found that was really useful.
Other questions? Yes.
Not exactly a question, but a comment about this discussion that was going on, because we have a reading group on 1,000 Plateaus. Right now we're reading
Big
it.
advantage.
What they talk about is variable coefficients of deterritorialization. That might be a helpful thing for these cases. Which means you have to look at the mixtures of the striated and the smooth spaces and find out what are the variable coefficients at any moment. And then again they talk about the binaries that they build in order to destroy the previous binaries, and then they have to destruct their own binaries that they built. So these are all temporary binaries that they built, but it's always in a state of flux.
I think then probably at that point we will all go away and read more about read our Deleuze. Thank you very much for